Hello and welcome back to Bicycle Legs and another edition of In Defense of. And today I have a guest, Davy Gallagher. It's always a pleasure to have you on the channel. Wonderful to see you. And today we're going to be talking about a pretty controversial album in this artist's catalogue. It's the debut album by Wings, and that is Wildlife. Now, at the time when this album first came out, it was absolutely lambasted by the critics. It did not do very well in the charts at all by sort of, Paul McCartney / Beatles standards. But Davy and we're going to argue that this album definitely needs to be sort of reviewed and reassessed critically. So, Davy, did you have any sort of opening thoughts for us on this album?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me back. I love this era of Paul McCartney because to me it almost forms a little trilogy where McCartney is like his grief album, What Am I Without the Beatles? It's, I'm homespun and what am I? And then Ram is very much, I think I'm pop. I'm Paul partner, and it makes a masterpiece that takes decades to be reappraised and does become reappraised and a massively influential album. But then he makes this album, which is very much okay, well, I did that on my own. What can I do with a band again? What's Paul McCartney in a band like that isn't the Beatles? So it's kind of interesting. Every album that he made for these three, I'm not including the Family Way soundtrack, obviously, but every album that he made out of these first three are almost like a totally different fresh start in a way for a different type of McCartney.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fascinating. And I think he's trying to discover himself all over again and balance, how can I be a rock star when I'm actually quite happy and content in my personal life? And then the commercial aspect, obviously, of I'm still an Apple recording artist, and there's the expectations that are connected to that. There's a lot of money that needs to be made to recoup some of the business practices that we know we won't go into all of that, but that we're going on. So it's a fascinating period, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that Paul was the only one of the Beatles who went to actually form a working band, a long-term working band, even though there would only be sort of the three members who would be in every incarnation of Wings. It's still an interesting concept, just the idea of forming a band after being in the biggest band in the world. So, yeah, I mean, this album, one of the first things I got from it, we'll go through it track by track, but just quickly, one of the first things I listened to this again last night, and the first thing that hit me is what a beautiful sounding record this album is.
Yeah.
It just sounds so good.
It's recorded at Abbey Road again for the first time since he left the Beatles. The first two he recorded up here in Scotland, homespun, Mull of Kintyre, but he decided for this one to go back. It probably wouldn't got Denny Lane to, the Mull of Kintyre and that part of the world's very rural to this day. It's lovely, but it's very rural, very wet, very damp, very not rock and roll. So perfect for someone like Paul McCartney getting back to the basics in life, but not perfect for an actual rock band. So perfect for him doing his own little thing and overdubs and whatnot, but not perfect for an actual band project. So going back to Abbey Road obviously gives them a lot more technology to play with, which gives it a fidelity that's not been on the first two albums, which I love. I mean, I love Ram's lo-fi aesthetic. I think it's absolutely majestic. But there's an audio quality here, and there's an attempt at making something more progressive pop with the harmonies and the guitar parts that he wasn't even trying to do on those first two records. He was just trying to put something together. But here there's an attempt to make something more traditionally cohesive rock.
Yeah. It doesn't hurt when you have Alan Parsons as one of your engineers either, does it?
No, I think that'll do. Yeah, that'll do.
So the first song on the album is Mambo. Really rockin' start to the album. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean that's the best word for it. It is a complete rocker. It's quite insane. I love Macca when he does the hollering stuff. Like, Oh Darling's one of my favorite Beatles tracks, no matter how simple it is, because when Paul lets his throat just rip, I think he's got one of the great rock voices, and we do get to hear a lot of that here. It sounds like Little Richard doing a warm-up session or something. And when he's doing the I can't do those parts, but when he's doing those parts, and then you get a little organ stab at the same time going along with it. That's so cool. I love that to bits. You only get the organ stab matching his vocals. It's majestic. It's a fun rocker. It's like Paul's version of garage rock or something. It's heavy as hell. The two guitar approach is brilliant because it's intentionally not caring if it's sloppy. So there's almost a bit of the faces in it or something in the guitar interplay, where they're doing just dirty rock and roll, and Paul doing his old school hollering, and it's called mumbo. It might as well be called mumbo jumbo because the lyrics here do not matter at all. I don't think there are decipherable lyrics in a few places, but it works. It's much like a lot of this album. It's not about the constituent parts. It's about the feel and the tone and the vibe of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And for Mumbo, it just tells you straight away, fun, rock and roll band, old school, heavy.
Yeah. Well, I believe that this song, like they were playing it instrumentally in the studio, and Tony Clark, the other engineer, hit the record button.
Yeah.
And Paul noticed, and he basically made the lyrics up on the spot.
Yeah.
So that's why they probably don't make an awful lot of sense.
Yeah, and that's why you get the only part that you can really make out is where hit it, Tony.
Yeah.
There's vague, the very cliched, when I move to the left, when I move to the right. So
Yeah.
Paul knows old school rock and roll songs, so he knows the kind of things to toss off the top of his head. It's the Harlem Shuffle. You move it to the left, you move it to the right, that kind of thing. And he's just bringing that here with just a wonderful rock and roll feel.
But isn't it though? I mean, this song just absolutely kicks ass.
Yeah.
But you talk about the guitars being a little bit sloppy and all that sort of thing. They weave together really wonderfully well, I think.
It's difficult to intentionally sound that sloppy and good at the same time. That's where the faces and nothing.
Yeah, I wonder if this song was the impetus for Paul to bring a second guitar player into the band too.
Yeah.
Because of course he would get Henry McCulloch into the band after this album.
Yeah.
So
you can hear it. You can very much hear, but you can also hear the complete lack of structure that you don't associate with Wings. Wings' guitar sound obviously would become much more mainstream, if you like, but certainly much more honed once they do get hit in a procession of players going through the 70s. But it would become much more structured, is the best way to put it, I suppose. With Band on the Run is a perfect example, where he's doing these mini suites again, so it has to have structure to it. Whereas this, it is just an improv. It sounds like you're listening to just a recording session where they're just having a blast, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a rave up, and it's a wonderful rave up at that. So the second song is Bip Bop. This is the one I think that probably divides people more than any other on the album.
I don't quite know why. I think it's really fun. There's a little bit of in the summertime by Mungo Jerry to it. I always love when electric guitar is strummed almost like it's an acoustic instrument. Sometimes, and we get quite a lot of that in that. There's an R&B feel, but there's also a bluegrass feel. Nothing should work. For a lot of people, it doesn't work. That's one of the problems. But for me, it just absolutely does. The goofiness of the lyrics with the I mean, we're 2 tracks in, and not a lyric has mattered, and not once have I missed a lyric. Not once have I thought, "No, come on, Paul, write something serious for a second," because it's just fun. It feels like a liberation of Paul McCartney, the rocker, for these open tracks. Bebop's a bit more laid back. I'd say it's got more of an R&B groove to it. It's certainly a groovy track more than an outright stomper. But it's still absolutely bangs, in places. I really like it. I love vocal lines that follow guitar lines in music. That always gets me as well, and to do that here, yeah, that'll do.
Yeah, no, I've over the years, I kind of struggled with this song growing up because, you sort of think, this guy was in the Beatles and now he's singing, these sort of almost baby talk lyrics, as it were. But as you said, I've really come to sort of love this song because it is so free and fun. As you said, it's just a lot of fun, and it is still a well-crafted song, I think. I mean, the lyrics, as you say, they don't matter a jot, but musically, it's absolutely well-crafted song. And again, you said the vocal line going along with the guitar line, and I really, really like that too. The way Paul sings this song too, with that sort of throaty, almost hoarse kind of vocal that he does on it, he's trying out a lot of different voices on this album, which I always liked that, because I always thought Paul was the most versatile singer in the Beatles. I mean, not to say that, John and George were great singers, but they didn't have the versatility that Paul did, that they could do, all the different kind of styles with their voice and that. And so I like that. But it is, I can see why people struggle with this song, because I did struggle with it when I was younger. But now I've really come to appreciate it for, the lovely piece of, it's kind of whimsical, and I like that. But I think that's not what people wanted from Paul at the time.
And it also plays into one criticism the album gets, is that it didn't include some of the successful songs of the time. Hi, Hi, Hi. Give Ireland Back to the Irish, to name a couple. But to me, that goes back to old school Beatles mentality of don't make your fans pay twice for the same thing, which is why the Beatles had such great singles and EPs separate from the albums, and made something like the Past Masters, as we've come to know them, such an essential release. But yeah, to me, this is a piece, and you couldn't take it bit bop and put in Give Ireland Back to the Irish. No. It's not an either or situation, just because it's the same timeline, same period. I think he's intentionally making an album, and he was intentionally making singles, and never the twain shall meet. Well, he dropped that in a few albums' time, but at the moment, never the twain shall meet.
Yeah. No, that's a good point too. I mean, Give Ireland Back to the Irish came like a little bit after this album. I think it was sort of like early 72.
Yeah,
but,
so it's after the album, yeah. But
yeah.
Hi Hi sure was the single at the time, and that was banned by the BBC. Can't be singing about Hi.
As
as
was
was.
Give Ireland Back to the Irish,
But
which,
Paul's the nice singer. He's very safe and bland, but there he has two singles in a row banned by the BBC. So,
yeah, and then he turns around and just like completely deliberately overcorrects with Mary Had a Little Lamb.
yeah, and My Love Can Tire later on. It's the
Yeah.
dichotomy of Paul, which I always think is quite interesting with McCartney, especially because people always talk about John Lennon as the one with the message, whereas Paul had his Ireland's freedom song before John Lennon recorded Luck of the Irish for sometime in New York City.
Yeah.
But McCartney was not sitting on the fence about things. There's this misconception, which I think is going away now, but it certainly was around for a long time, that McCartney was, just the silly love songs Beatle. Wise, whereas John had something powerful to say, and to me that underestimates Paul and overestimates John, because John had his plethora of saccharine, lovey-dovey songs as well.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that. People always act as if it's a cardinal sin to have these kind of songs. But speaking of love songs, I think we're due on, aren't we? With the
Yes.
track.
Love is Strange, which is a cover version. So Wings did not do a lot of cover versions over the years. So and they do this, in a sort of a bit of a reggae-ish style, which is something that Paul had flirted with the Beatles as well, with things like Obla Di Obla Da. I love this cover version. I think it's really, really good. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, there's reggae tinges throughout the album. It was just the way the British music scene was at the time, where reggae landed in the UK a lot earlier than it ever did in America, and it never really took off in America in a big way. But it was appropriated and then popularized by Clapton of all people, with his "I Shot the Sheriff" and things, as cover of Bob Marley. But here we're hearing a complete non-reggae song. So they're taking the sensibility of one genre and applying it to an early, it's not even a rock and roll song, Love is Strange. It's a pop rock song from was it 1960 odds? No, it must be earlier than that, because Buddy Holly did it, so it must be the mid-50s.
Yeah.
So who did the original? It was Mickey and
I can't.
Mickey and Sylvia?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
And then Buddy Holly did it, so it must have been before 57, because that's when he died, wasn't it? About then, 57?
58, I think
58.
he died, yeah.
So it must have been before then. But as you say, this is very reggae tinged, and I like that this it's not the structure of something like Band in the Run or one of his more structured songs later on, but it still has three quite distinctive sections. There's the opening kind of minute and a half instrumental part, which is very vibe led, and then the middle part they're all singing in harmony, a wonderful harmony, and then the last part is mostly Paul's voice up front. So it's kind of three distinctive parts to break it down quite a bit.
Yeah.
Which gives it a really nice flow, and doesn't it stops it from feeling 5 minutes long. It never feels it's like. I think it's got some lovely harmonies on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is as good a point as any to talk about Linda and her vocals on this album, because she features quite prominently on about 3 or 4 of the songs on this album. And, she was one of the, she copped so much stick for being in this band. And I think her vocals on this album, and on this song in particular, are absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
She never got her dues as a singer, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and it's always going to happen when you're given your position and you haven't earned it. So she gets to work with Paul McCartney because she's married to Paul McCartney. But them's the breaks, kids. That's she was already a famous photographer in her own right. It's not as if she was a nobody from nowhere.
Yeah.
just like Yoko, who was a successful artist in her own field. And just like Yoko, Linda's vocals became a punching bag, and completely unfairly, because we have seen, and again, I think this is something that Time's been very kind to. At the time, female singers were expected to have more vibrato and be more expressive. Judy Collins, Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, etc., etc. And Linda definitely isn't that. But in an era where we've had now, 30 years of indie pop, indie rock, and vocalists who are all about the expression rather than the ability, I think Time's been very kind to Linda's vocals. Live you can find isolated recordings of her where she's absolutely terrible. She's playing terrible keyboards, but hey, that's whatever. In the studio, on a couple of tracks here, her voice is perfectly what it needs to be, and more importantly, she's literally Paul's muse, and you can hear the happiness coming off of Paul McCartney. And without Linda, you don't get happy Paul McCartney. So it's kind of catch-22. He didn't want to be a solo artist. Linda was always going to be there or thereabouts, and to be in a band with her, I think her vocals are fantastic. I mean, I do think Denny's vocals are underused in the whole Wings catalogue, but it's going to happen when you're in a band with Paul McCartney, and all Denny's really got is that One with the Blues record to his name. He's not really famous for much else, but Go Now is a great single from the 60s. I think Linda's got a nice, pleasant voice, which is used in a nice, pleasant way at its best. She's never going to, she did do a solo album later on, but yeah, she is what it needs to be for this more lo-fi production, I think.
And I wonder, if part of the reason this album got a lot of hate that it did was the fact that it is, Paul being so happy in his personal life and that sort of thing at a time when I think, a serious artist, is the way they like to mention it, was sort of supposed to be this tortured soul who was, that sort of thing. I think that, I wonder if that's why this often got dismissed as being lightweight.
Plus, there's the remnants of it's Paul's fault that the Beatles broke up.
Yeah, but that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that, like, in the in this day and age, everybody thinks, oh, it was Yoko, but in the early 70s, that was not how it was seen. It was very much seen as Paul was the bad guy.
Well, I think now we know it was the business deals led John to quit the Beatles, which now we've got the full story really.
Yes.
John literally resigned from the band, so that's what brought down the Beatles, and he did so as a protest about the Alan Klein situation and whatnot. But it was coming to a precipice anyway. George Harrison had too much going on. He couldn't be held back, and they weren't 21-year-olds anymore living in each other's pockets. They weren't the cheeky scousers from Hard Day's Night. They were grown men moving on with their lives, and it had to move on. And Paul took the fall for that really quite badly, and I think it's damaged him quite a lot. It seems to be very hurt to this day when that accusation comes his way. And I'm glad he's had the chance to be in his own lifetime, kind of to see that come full circle and the truth come out, because it was damaging for a long time to Paul's overall career, I think.
Yeah. So then we get on to the title track, Wildlife. And the thing I note about this album too is that both sides end with these sort of epic kind of tracks. And this is really a journey, this song. And it's also interesting for me because it's the first time you hear Paul doing a song to do with animal rights, which of course would become a huge thing for him and Linda throughout the years, and still is to this day for Paul.
Yeah. And although, by God, I remember being force-fed by my older brother, who's a vegetarian, vegan, no doubt, these days. Linda McCartney's Sausages in the 90s, and gee, they were not good. They might be better now, but they were not good at the time. But yeah, I love Wildlife. Again, Paul's voice on this is just insane. It's got that scratchiness, it's got a throatiness. It's the equivalent of John doing famously recording Twist and Shout at the end of the recording session because he knew he couldn't sing anything after it, so he had to record that last. This feels like Paul must have done something similar, because how could you sing anything after the way he's holding some of these throaty parts? You know, he's going wow, wow. You know, it's like, oh, you can actually feel your throat ripping to shreds. And to give it, this is quite famously the one where he makes a fluff that people kind of make fun of, where he says aminals rather than animals, but it kept it in. But to me, that just adds to the lo-fi aesthetic. The kind of, no, I think 5 of these were done in one take, and he didn't want to do drums. So to me, if he got the feeling of it down, the message of it definitely comes across. I mean, it's a bit clunky the way, you know, it starts with the word wild applies to the words you and me, and then it kind of kicks into the walking through the African park and animals having the right of way and things. So it's a bit clunky. But as you said, it's very much the start of Paul and Linda's crusade, which would be a lifelong endeavor. And when people do discover their new calling, they are kind of clunky, I think. You know, it's like there's nothing worse than a newborn, you know, someone who's maybe just found religion. They're the ones that want to convert you, not the people who've always been religious, or the people who are vegans. It's not the people who grew up vegans that want to tell you how terrible meat eating is. It's the ones who've just become vegan in the last 6 months. They're the real fundamentalists. So that's what it kind of comes off as here, where they've just discovered you know, they've been vegetarian, but this is where they really want to start making a stand about it. And the lyrics are clunky, but the message comes across really strongly, literally, and it's bluesy as hell. It's got a real melancholic feel, and I think it, you know, the parts about we're breathing so hard, but there's a lot of political nonsense in there. Yeah, I mean, you can take that straight up to modern day with the GOP summits and things, where, you know, climate change and whatnot, and how many species have probably gone extinct in the last 50 years since this album. You know, it's quite insane because of climate change and whatnot. So sometimes a well-intentioned clunky lyric is worth it, I think, just to get the message across. You don't need to always be allegorical. I think sometimes you can just be hitting them over the head because the message is worth it. I mean, it's delivered in such a bluesy, intense fashion. Yeah, any day this will.
Absolutely. You know, I think you've got it right there about the sort of the strident tone of a new convert is the way sort of the lyric comes across. But there's some beautiful touches in this song. As you said, it's very bluesy, but I love some of the backing vocals from Linda and Denny on this. You know, the sort of, you know, wildlife, ooh, whatever happened to is really beautiful. It's a lovely touch to the song. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can add much more to what you've said there, but I really think it's a great song. And it goes, you know, again, it's sort of got that sort of extended coda to it, you know, which I always love it when Paul does one of those, because I think he does them so well.
Yeah, so, I mean, the most obvious one is Hey Jude, isn't it?
Exactly.
You know, but yeah, he's had so many of them over the years. Paul McCartney can do that kind of thing and keep an audience going, and singing refrains for hours if he wants.
Yeah. So then we get on to side 2 and we start with Some People Never Know, which is, I mean, just the start of this song to me just sends shivers down my spine, that acoustic guitar at the beginning. just absolutely beautiful.
I do think this is a bit long. This is one of the only tracks where I do think I could lose 2 or 3 minutes from it. I love the acoustic playing on it. I really like sometimes when there's an artist who's using electric and acoustic, the tendency is on the acoustic tracks to be more mellow and laid back, but the acoustic playing here is really strong and intense. And I really like that. It's got a great build to it. I mean, the message of it said to be about Linda and John, depending on who you're talking to and whatnot. I don't know. I think it's just one of Paul's songs that work quite universally. I think it's a really strong opener. To the side, it's got a lovely build, a lovely quiet intensity. I think that's this album's strength, is it's either intense or quietly intense, but always with a kind of sense of fun in the background or a real menace in the background. There's some real shades of grey going on here, where the anger and fury of wildlife to go straight into, you know, flip the album over and straight into Some People Never Know. It's quite a judder, you know. It's quite a whoa, you know, that's quite a leap. I just think it's 6 minutes something. It's just a bit too long.
Yeah, no, that's a fair criticism. I think it's a song that probably would have been a lovely 4-minute song, I think. But again, some absolutely gorgeous harmonies from Linda on this song. She sings beautifully on this. And then speaking of which, we get into I Am Your Singer after that, which is a much shorter song. But, you know, you actually get to hear Linda doing some solo lead vocal on this one. Paul and Linda sort of trade lead vocals on this one. I think it's a really pretty little song, and very much a song about the two of them, isn't it? About, you know, their own relationship and stuff.
This is one of the few songs that you could put on Ram quite easily, or McCartney, come to think of it. It really is a perfect little marital bliss song. And as we know, they were always happily married. It's just Linda was taken ridiculously early. But otherwise, I've got no doubts they would have stayed together until, you know, today. And you can hear it here. They just enjoy each other's company. They're not just a couple. Paul was never going to have his long lost weekend like John did with May, whatever her name was, May Pang. He and Linda were meant to be, and you can hear it here. They're just delighted by each other's company. It comes across perfectly in such a simple, plaintive song. 2 minutes and change, that's all it needs to be, because it might get a little bit cloying if you have this for 4 minutes. You know, it's like that annoying couple. It's like when, you know, you're in a restaurant or something, it's like, right, leave it till you get up the road, folks. But it's nice. Yeah, that's normally a derogative for me, something that's nice, you know, because it means usually inoffensive and bland, but it actually is quite touching. It's really sweet, you know. It's got an innocence to it, that it's just nice. It's another facet to have on this album's bow. You know, this simple little song. Yeah,
I agree. It's one of the highlights for me, just because it is such a small song, but it's just so, the word I want to use is sweet, and I again, that gets used derogatorily too, and I don't think that should be. I think sometimes it's nice to have something that just makes you go, "Ah."
Yeah,
you know, and that's really what this song does for me. It just makes me think these two really, really were in love with each other, you know, and it's just nice to see.
It's why I've always loved, if not the song, then the idea of Paul's silly love songs, because he essentially wrote a protest song about the fact that people are down on love songs. I mean, you'd think that people would have had enough of silly love songs. I look around and see it isn't so. What's wrong with that? I want to know. So Paul's very much sharing that sentiment where what's wrong with a love song? And what's wrong with just being happy and contented and letting people know about it, and not everything needs to be miserable. And that exact same sentiment goes into songs like What's So Funny About Peace, Love and Understanding. And nobody's got a problem with that because it's delivered by more punky kind of guys like Elvis Costello or pub rock kind of guys like Nick Lowe. But again, people will use Paul McCartney as a bit of a whipping boy for that. That is a bit saccharine in places, that song. But Paul just has a lovely way with love songs. I mean, the guy writes Yesterday. I think he's got the monopoly on being able to say what's a good love song. So yeah.
I've always argued that Silly Love Songs is worth hearing just for that bass line anyway, because
there's some lovely bass parts throughout this even.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paul McCartney, for goodness sake, of course, there's great bass lines, but that had been missing a little bit on the first two solo records, Ram and self-titled, because of the overdub situation and doing it all himself. But it's great to hear Paul back on the bass here, and just it propels a few songs along on this album that might not otherwise have the legs if they were done more acoustically, in the Ram style, for example.
Yeah. So the next song is Tomorrow. What are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I mentioned Yesterday there, and I like that we've got this song. So we've got Yesterday and we've got Tomorrow. And I like that essentially the character here is worried that he's going to end up having to sing Yesterday, because he's worried about the romance and worried about love. So this isn't a song about him and Linda, obviously. This is him taking on more of a character again. So this is more of a traditional Paul McCartney just writing a pop song kind of affair. I think it's really worthy. It's very power pop. It's essentially, I think this is the Paul McCartney right here, that you can hear influencing someone like Eric Carmen for the Raspberries.
Yeah.
On tracks like I'm gonna try a little harder. What's it called from the Raspberries? Anyway, the big long epic in the middle of Don't Want to Say Goodbye on the Raspberries debut. Very much, this is the Paul McCartney that's influencing tracks like that, which are low-key gorgeous, with sweeping without having to have, say, a big string section or something. It's just got lovely piano parts, lovely guitar parts, a really nice melody to it, and a sense of melancholia that kind of propels the whole emotion along. And to me, that would just bleed into, again, the power pop phenomenon that would follow, low-key phenomenon, because it wasn't a massively big seller of a genre, but this is the Paul that would influence that for me.
Yeah. This song melodically, I don't think would have sounded out of place on a record like Abbey Road. Just it's a really beautiful Paul melody. It's probably one of his most complicated melodies on this album, I think, just the way it all gets put together. But it's an absolutely gorgeous song. And it is, it's interesting that he wrote a song called Yesterday and a song called Tomorrow. And this song does have that sort of wistfulness, I think, to the lyric, sort of, wondering what is it going to be like and that sort of thing. It's one of the absolute highlights on the album for me, this song, just because it's so melodically gorgeous.
Yeah. We did have the Bitbop link in between the two tracks. But we do have these two odd little transitional parts, links as they're called in the track list. I mean, one of them's not even a link because it ends the record. Mumbo, it could be called Mumbo Reprise or something, but it's not. Reprise rather. But that's a strange little addition. And it certainly very odd to put it in between I'm Your Singer and Tomorrow, but I like it. It gives it that kind of I'll do what I want, DIY. Oh, I don't want to say punk approach, but punk-ish approach of it's my record. I'll just if I think it sounds good, I don't need to explain why. It doesn't need to, you know, it's almost an Alex Chilton type thing, of it's my record, I'll do what I like. Doesn't need the explanation.
And the thing is, you get the original vinyl, you don't even get those links mentioned.
Yeah,
they're kind of little hidden tracks, as it were. So yeah. So yeah, then it closes out with Dear Friend, which is sort of the other, what I sort of consider an epic track on the album. This is the one where you could have, you know, he didn't go for it, but you could, I reckon, hear a big orchestration on this song, if he'd wanted to go that way with this one. And obviously this one, you know, lyrically is very much directed at John, sort of almost an olive branch, as it were, to try and paper over some of the rifts that had gone on between them around the time of Ram and Imagine and, you know, How Do You Sleep and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and some of that was truly horrible. And you know, when you see some of the footage of John recording How Do You Sleep, and he's using some really bad language. I mean, I've got no problem with that kind of language, but in the context he's using, it's really aggressive. And that context is king for that kind of language. You can tell there was a real anger between the two of them there. And they did become friends again. It was great, you know, they did make up. And it's nice to hear Paul just reaching out to John at the end. I mean, conventional wisdom would tell you to put something like the love song at the end, something for Linda, you know, that kind of thing to leave as the final note. But instead, the last thing he wants you to hear, apart from a really blistering 45 seconds of mumble reprise, is him trying to mend things with John Lennon in a very low-key fashion. And you're right, I think it works more for being low-key and not having orchestration and whatnot, because the more Paul McCartney is the only thing you hear on it, which would be that diluted by an orchestra or a brass section or whatnot, then the less sincere the message is, and it just gets swamped out by the sound itself. So to me, it's one of those things where it's more pure because it's simple and because it doesn't go over the top and it isn't over arranged and overproduced. And he didn't get George Martin in just to do this one track and make it a big sweeping epic. It's a song of friendship on an album that sometimes is about nothing, sometimes it's about love, sometimes it's about animal rights, but it's always about whatever Paul's thinking. And I think it's almost a stream of consciousness album in a way, and I don't think that's too intentional. I don't think he was thinking along those lines. But Paul is someone who has followed absurdist art and absurdist comedy. You know, he was a big fan of the Goons and whatnot. So you can see him, you can see the appeal of something like that to Paul, where it's just a grab bag, it's just a lucky bag, a licorice all sorts of ideas and thoughts, and some of them are developed, some of them aren't, some of them are low-key, some of them are a bit more up-tempo, and there isn't a cohesive Abbey Road side to type structure to any of it. I think that works in its favor. And again, it's Paul trying to establish, what am I in a band? So we're kind of coming full circle to that. And the way he leaves us is with the reminisce of his old band member and his old friend. And that could have been dangerous as well, because, you know, if you remind people, hey, I'm Paul McCartney from the Beatles, you're inviting comparisons to who you are now. And it's crazy that this was 3 albums on, but we're still only the year after Let It Be, but it seems like a lifetime.
Yeah.
In terms of Bridge Under Troubled Water. But yeah, it's a lovely way to go out. And actually, I would take Mumbo off that little stinger at the end. As funny as it is to kind of go out with something like that, it does kind of detract from the lovely sentiment of Dear Friend. And even though I'm extolling the virtues of do what you want and a nice DIY aesthetic, I think it does undercut the message to instantly go into this really heavy, aggressive guitar from Mumbo.
Yeah. Now, just to sort of wrap things up, why do you think, McCartney and Ram have both sort of had this critical reappraisal over the last sort of 10, 12 years or so, and this album hasn't?
McCartney has Maybe I'm Amazed, is I think a major reason. There's not one song here, not one that's considered an all-timer for the general public. So that's the album that had Maybe I'm Amazed. Even when people did hate it, it was, at least it's called Maybe I'm Amazed. Ram doesn't have that either. That doesn't have one, well, no, it does have Uncle Albert, I suppose. But even that's not too much of a radio song. It's quite strange that became a hit, to be honest. But the overall structure of Ram has become so identifiable in indie pop, and so many bands came back to that as their reference point. They weren't influenced by Band on the Run. They weren't influenced by Red Rose Speedway or London Town. They were influenced by Ram. And I think that shows, because it feels like the most cohesive McCartney record of that era for me. But this doesn't. This is almost just everything in a blender and just pour the contents out. So I'm not surprised that it's not had a reappraisal. I'm not surprised that some people don't like it. And I don't think it ever will be considered a lost classic. And I don't really consider it top tier McCartney. Just because we're defending it doesn't mean we're saying it's a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the whole point of this series. I mean, I did a Paul McCartney top 10 a few months back. This did not make my top 10. That doesn't mean that we don't like this album. This album actually is a pretty darn good album. It's not top shelf McCartney, but it's definitely not the absolute stinker that the critics thought it was at the time. People were accusing him on this album of being deliberately second rate. That was one quote I remember reading. And I don't get that at all with this album. I think this is a fine little album.
Yeah, and I think those people are also quite disrespectful of Paul as a human being. Just because he had been Paul McCartney of the Beatles, they were kind of expecting, well, why aren't you making more like that? That's a rather lofty goal for anybody. And he would produce massive hits, as we know. Band on the Run, Live and Let Die, Mull of Kintyre, biggest selling single of all time in the UK, for goodness sake. So Paul would go on to produce some massively successful stuff. But you're right, some of the stuff that comes afterwards is a lot worse than this. A lot worse. In fact, even for Wings, London Town's worse than this any day of the week.
Yeah.
Red Rose is worse than this any day of the week for me.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And for Paul's solo career, I mean, Tug of War, Pipes of Peace, On the Ground, Off the Ground, whatever it's called. I like Flowers in the Dirt, actually. That's a kind of the one that Elvis Costello was quite involved with. But to me, there's a lot more McCartney that's worse than this. And this has kind of gone up by default in the rankings. But for what I think people, and it's inevitable, people compare him far too much to his Beatles self and don't want to see him stretch. And he's played into that in decades past. I mean, obviously at first Wings toured the UK and university campuses. They just played small, tiny venues, student unions. and didn't play any Beatles material whatsoever. Didn't announce who they were. They just toured the UK up and down, playing to a couple of hundred drunk students who were like, "Is that Paul McCartney?" No, of course not. So he was very much literally trying to find out, who am I? You know, he's going on a journey, but because he's not considered particularly deep, like John Lennon, people don't really give him that freedom. Whereas if John Lennon makes mistakes and makes bad music, people automatically assume, "Oh, I must just not get it because John Lennon is very smart." Whereas there's this kind of snobbery about Paul McCartney from some quarters, which again I think is a lot better than it used to be. But people will just say, "Oh, that's crap. Paul's just made some crap music." Whereas John gets a free pass because he was obviously just thinking too far ahead for me, you know.
Yeah.
But no, Paul's a genius. Paul is, I mean, he's Paul McCartney, for goodness sake. He doesn't need to defend himself to anybody, but these individual albums that don't get the praise that they should, I think do need champions. And yeah, we're not saying it's top 5, top 10, but it probably would be in my top 15. Probably. I mean, my favorite McCartney record is Chaos and Creation in the Backyard.
That's a great album.
Love it to bits, but it's such a different record. So Paul doesn't get the credit, I don't think, for his adventurous nature. The Fireman Project, for example, I love those records. The operas that he did, the classical pieces, they go over my head. That's not my frame of reference, so I wouldn't know if it's good or bad. But I don't think Paul has ever received the credit for being quite so open to absolutely anything that he really deserves. He's not as safe as people think he is. And I think he's probably caused that himself, actually, by pretty much for the last 30 odd years playing the stadiums with Hey Jude and, you know, the big sing-along epics. And he hasn't promoted the old material as much. He hasn't done a Bob Dylan or a Neil Young where all songs are equal and you're as likely to hear an obscurity as you are a hit. Paul has very much said, these people want to hear Sgt. Pepper's, I'm going to give them it. He's a populist, but he does have these, I'm sorry, I'm really ranting here tonight.
Yeah, that's all right.
We're defending. He does have these artistic tendencies that I just don't think he's ever had the proper appraisal for, where he puts himself out there making strange, unusual music, which is what this is, very much so, that George wouldn't have been able to make, John wouldn't have been able to make, and, well, Ringo might have by accident, but it wouldn't have been intentional. And I just don't think that Paul's legacy is quite what it should be, which is quite ridiculous to say when you're talking about one of the most famous musicians of all time.
Yeah.
Almost like there is I don't know, maybe that's good in a way. There's a hidden chapter, you know, there's a layer for us to kind of discover as Uber fans that you don't get if you just buy the All the Best and Wingspan and these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I wanted to sort of mention before we sort of sign off is just, I've always admired the fact that Paul, rather than just resting on his Beatles laurels and being able to release whatever he wanted, he really made a conscious effort to start from the ground up again. You know, you're talking about that university tour and things like that. He wanted to pay his dues all over again, as it were. And I think that's an incredibly admirable thing for somebody as huge as Paul McCartney to even attempt to do.
Yeah. And he's you know, he didn't defend himself. He just let himself be attacked for years by people. And he took, especially after John was killed, because he didn't want to be the guy who was saying John broke up the Beatles when, you know, the world was still mourning John, you know. So he just let himself become the dartboard for so many people. And he was content, you know, who cares what they say? I'm with Linda, we're up on the Mull of Kintyre, let them write what they write. I mean, for goodness sake, some people still think he died in 1966. So, you know, who cares what some people say? But at the same time, I kind of wish that he'd taken on a bit more urgency. But then look what happened when he did. And do you remember when he tried to change some of the credits to McCartney and Lennon?
Mm.
Yeah, that backfired on, was that Let It Be Naked he tried to do that on, or was it the live?
It was the one of the live albums, I think.
Yeah, was that Back in the USA? I think it was the one with
something
him.
like that. Yeah.
So, and that backfired massively. And his autobiography, I don't know if you've read it,
No, I haven't.
he goes into in clinical detail Beatles songs and starts saying this one was probably 40% John, 60% me. This one was, and it's like, stop this. You're Paul McCartney. You don't need to do this kind of thing. So maybe it's for the best that he's not tried to defend himself too much for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, to some people, he's always going to be that cheesy guy who tried to change the credits, who broke up the Beatles, and who's only good to roll out for charity shows at Wembley and give the thumbs up and do Hey Jude as an encore. And that's fine because he's Paul McCartney, and long after those people have gone, people will still be listening to his music.
Yeah. So there you have it, everyone. This is our defense of Wings Wildlife. Thank you again, Davy, for coming and doing this with me. It's been a great show. I've really enjoyed it. For anybody who may be watching who's not subscribed to Davy's Cinema Flicks and Music Picks, please go and subscribe to that channel. It's a wonderful, wonderful channel. We'll leave a link in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel out. If you're new to the channel, please go and have a look at some of my other videos because that really helps out too. Everything's playlisted, so if you want to see any of my other In Defense Of shows, there's a playlist for those. Or if you want to see my studio albums ranked shows, there's a playlist for those. Or if you want to see any of my appearances on other people's channels, I have a playlist for those as well. So if you want to follow me on social media, I'm at bicyclelegs on Instagram and Twitter, and I now have a dedicated bicyclelegs Facebook page. Links are all in the description, so please come and give those a like and join in the conversation. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.